God says, it's important, don't pass by. God message today. God's message. Now what if the very moment you almost scrolled past was the exact moment someone needed to stop you? What if there's something happening in your life right now that you've been quietly ignoring, telling yourself it can wait, when really it's been waiting for you? I need you to actually pause here, because this isn't a random message that landed in front of you by accident. Something in your life right now needs your attention, and if you keep scrolling past it the way you've been avoiding it in real life, you might miss the exact window you've been given to address it. Don't pass this by. Not tonight. You've been carrying something, haven't you? A nagging feeling you've gotten good at ignoring. Maybe it's a decision you've been avoiding, a relationship you know needs attention, a part of your life you've quietly let slide because addressing it felt overwhelming. You tell yourself you'll deal with it later, when things calm down, when you have more energy, when the timing feels better, but later keeps becoming later. And the thing you've been avoiding hasn't gone away. It's just been sitting there, quietly growing heavier, waiting for you to finally stop walking past it. Have you been avoiding something important in your life, convincing yourself it can wait a little longer? Why later often becomes never. Here's something worth admitting honestly. The things we tell ourselves we'll deal with later often never actually get dealt with at all. Later isn't a real plan. It's a comfortable excuse that lets you avoid discomfort today while quietly building consequences for tomorrow. The conversation you keep postponing, the health concern you keep dismissing, the relationship you keep neglecting, none of that resolves itself simply because you've delayed facing it. What have you been telling yourself you'll handle later? That's actually just been sitting there, unresolved, month after month. Why this moment might be your actual window. Here's something worth considering seriously. Some opportunities to address what matters don't stay open indefinitely. A relationship you could still repair today might become permanently damaged if left unaddressed much longer. A health concern that's manageable now might become far more serious if ignored further. A decision you could still make freely today might be taken out of your hands entirely if you wait too long to act. This moment, right now, might be exactly the window you've been given, and windows like this don't always reopen. Could this actually be your window to address something before it closes completely? Why you've been afraid to look directly at this? Here's something worth naming honestly. Part of the reason you've avoided facing this is fear. Fear of what you'll find. Fear of how much work it will take to fix. Fear that facing it head-on will confirm something you've been trying not to fully accept. That fear is understandable, but avoiding the truth doesn't make it less true. It just delays the moment. You'll eventually have to face it anyway, usually under worse conditions than you're facing right now. What fear has been keeping you from looking directly at whatever you've been avoiding? If this is landing somewhere real in you, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 2 goes even deeper into exactly how to face what you've been avoiding. Why, this isn't about panic, it's about attention. Here's something important to clarify. This message isn't meant to create panic or fear in you. It's meant to redirect your attention towards something that's been quietly asking for it. There's a difference between anxious, frantic reaction and calm, intentional attention. You don't need to spiral into worry tonight. You simply need to stop avoiding and start genuinely looking at whatever this is with clear, calm honesty. Can you approach whatever you've been avoiding with calm attention, rather than anxious avoidance or sudden panic? why someone in your life might be waiting for you to nurture them. Here's something worth considering carefully. Sometimes the thing you're being told not to pass by isn't a task or a decision at all. It's a person. Someone in your life might be quietly struggling, waiting for you to notice, hoping you'll reach out before they have to ask directly. If someone has crossed your mind repeatedly, unexpectedly, that repetition might not be coincidence. Is there someone who's crossed your mind recently that you haven't reached out to yet? Who might actually need to hear from you? Why your own well-being might be what you've been passing by. Here's something worth turning inward on. Sometimes the thing being pointed to isn't external at all. It's your own well-being, your own exhaustion, your own need for rest, your own health that you've been neglecting while taking care of everyone and everything else. You cannot keep pouring from an empty container indefinitely. If you've been ignoring your own needs, this message might be specifically asking you to finally stop passing yourself by too. Have you been so focused on everyone else's needs that you've completely neglected your own? If this is resonating with you, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 2 goes deeper into finally addressing what you've been avoiding. High acting today matters more than waiting for perfect clarity. Here's something worth releasing tonight: the belief that you need complete clarity, a perfect plan, and full confidence before you're allowed to take the first step. Most meaningful action begins with uncertainty, with a single small step taken before everything makes complete sense. Waiting for perfect clarity before acting often just becomes another form of avoidance, disguised as responsible patience. What's one small step you could take today, even without complete clarity, toward finally addressing what you've been avoiding? Truth for today: this message wasn't random. Whatever you've been avoiding, whoever's been on your mind, whatever part of your own life you've been neglecting, tonight is an invitation to finally stop passing it by. Not with panic, but with calm, intentional attention. The window you've been given might not stay open indefinitely, and the cost of continued avoidance is almost always higher than the discomfort of finally facing it directly. If you finally stopped avoiding whatever this is and faced it with calm honesty tonight, what do you think would actually change? You've spent so long avoiding something important, telling yourself later would be a better time to face it. But later keeps slipping further away, and what you've been avoiding hasn't disappeared. It's simply been waiting, quietly, for you to finally stop passing it by. This is only part 1. Part 2 goes deeper into exactly how to face what you've been avoiding, and how to take that first step with confidence instead of fear. If this message reached something real in you tonight, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because part 2 continues exactly where this left off. Don't pass this by. Not tonight. In part 1, we talked about the thing you've been quietly avoiding, telling yourself later would be a better time to face it. We talked about the window that might be closing, and the fear that's been keeping you from looking directly at it. So today, let's go further. Now that you know something needs your attention, how do you actually face it? Because knowing you need to act is one thing. Actually taking that first step, especially when fear has kept you frozen for so long, is a completely different challenge. Are you ready to finally move? Here's what tends to happen even after someone recognizes they've been avoiding something important. They still don't know where to start. The task feels too big, too overwhelming, too tangled with fear and uncertainty to approach all at once. So instead of taking a small step forward, they freeze completely, right at the exact moment movement matters most. Have you ever recognized something needed your attention, but felt so overwhelmed by its size that you didn't know where to even begin? Why the first step is always smaller than you think. Here's something worth understanding clearly. The first step toward facing what you've been avoiding is almost always smaller and simpler than the mental image you've built up around it. You don't have to solve the entire problem today. You don't have to have the perfect conversation, the complete plan, the full resolution all figured out immediately. You simply have to take one small, honest step forward today, regardless of how imperfect that step might feel. What is the smallest possible step you could take today without needing the entire situation resolved all at once? Why waiting for the right feeling keeps you stuck? Here's a trap worth recognizing. Many people wait to feel ready, confident, or emotionally prepared before taking action, assuming that feeling has to arrive first before movement becomes possible. But readiness rarely arrives before action. It usually arrives because of action, built through the simple experience of having already taken the first step, regardless of how unready you felt beforehand. Have you been waiting to feel ready before acting, when readiness might actually only arrive after you've already started? Why facing this might not be as bad as your imagination has built it up to be. Here's something worth considering honestly. The anxious version of this situation that's been playing in your mind is almost always worse than the reality actually turns out to be. Anticipation tends to exaggerate difficulty far beyond what's actually waiting for you once you finally face it directly. The conversation you've been dreading, the decision you've been avoiding. Once you actually engage with it, it's rarely as unbearable as the anxious anticipation made it seem. Has your imagination been building this situation into something far worse than what actually might be waiting for you? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 3 goes even deeper into what happens once you finally take this step. Why you don't have to do this perfectly. Here's something worth releasing completely. The pressure to face this situation flawlessly, saying exactly the right words, making exactly the right decision, handling everything with complete composure. You're allowed to face this imperfectly, stumbling over your words, feeling nervous, making mistakes along the way. Progress doesn't require perfection. It simply requires movement, even messy, imperfect movement in the right direction. Can you release the pressure to handle this perfectly and simply allow yourself to move forward imperfectly instead? Why support might be closer than you realize. Here's something worth considering. You don't have to face this entirely alone. Somewhere in your life, there's likely someone who could offer genuine support, perspective, or simply a listening presence while you take this step. Isolation often makes difficult situations feel more overwhelming than they actually are. Reaching out for support isn't weakness. It's wisdom, recognizing that you were never meant to carry everything entirely by yourself. Who in your life could offer genuine support as you take this step, if you were willing to reach out and ask? Why this step today protects your future self. Here's something worth considering with real clarity. The discomfort of facing this today is temporary, but the relief of finally addressing it will extend far into your future. Meanwhile, the discomfort of continued avoidance doesn't stay temporary. It compounds, quietly, into larger consequences down the road. Acting today isn't just about resolving discomfort in this moment. It's about genuinely protecting the person you'll become months and years from now. How will taking this step today actually protect and benefit the future version of yourself? If this perspective is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 3 continues exploring exactly what unfolds once you take this step. Why this moment of action matters more than the outcome itself. Here's something worth understanding deeply. The outcome of facing this situation matters, but the act of finally facing it, regardless of outcome, matters even more. Taking this step proves something to yourself. That you're capable of confronting difficulty instead of avoiding it indefinitely. That fear doesn't have to permanently control your decisions. That proof becomes valuable far beyond this single situation, shaping how you approach every difficult moment still ahead of you. What would it prove to yourself? Simply by taking this step today, regardless of how the outcome actually unfolds. Truth for today: you don't need the entire situation figured out today. You simply need one small, honest step forward, taken imperfectly, without waiting for the perfect feeling of readiness to arrive first. The anxious anticipation you've built up is almost always worse than the actual reality waiting for you. And whatever support you need might be closer than you've allowed yourself to reach for. If you took just one small step today, right now, toward facing what you've been avoiding, what would that step actually look like? You've learned something today that makes this entire situation feel far more approachable. That the first step is always smaller than your fear has made it seem. That readiness comes after action rather than before it, and that support is likely closer than you've allowed yourself to reach for. Take that first step today, even imperfectly, even nervously, even without complete clarity. There's more ahead. Part 3 goes into what happens after you take this step and how to keep moving forward even when the path ahead still isn't fully clear. If this message is helping you move forward, subscribe now, because part 3 continues exactly where this left off. Don't pass this by. Take the step today. What if the version of your story where you kept ignoring this message actually exists somewhere, playing out right now, in the lives of people who dismissed the exact same nudge you almost dismissed tonight? What if the difference between where you're standing now and where they ended up wasn't talent, or luck, or timing? It was simply the choice to finally stop and listen when everyone else around them kept walking. I want you to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment tonight, because understanding what happens when this message gets ignored is exactly what makes tonight's choice matter as much as it does. You've probably seen it before, haven't you? Someone who had every sign pointed directly at them, every warning, every repeated nudge, and they kept walking past it anyway. Maybe it was someone close to you. Maybe it was someone you watched from a distance, wondering why they couldn't see what seemed so obvious to everyone else. And the ending, when it finally came, wasn't sudden. It was the slow accumulation of every moment they chose to look away instead of facing what was right in front of them. Watching that unfold, even from the outside, leaves a particular kind of unease. The quiet fear that you might be doing the exact same thing in your own life right now, without fully realizing it. Have you ever watched someone ignore repeated warnings and felt a quiet fear that you might be doing the same thing yourself? Ignored warnings don't disappear, they just change shape. Here's something worth understanding clearly. When someone repeatedly ignores an important message, the situation it was pointing toward doesn't simply vanish because it went unaddressed. It changes shape, usually growing heavier, more complicated, more difficult to untangle the longer it's left alone. The relationship that could have been repaired with one honest conversation becomes unrepairable after years of silence. The health concern that could have been managed early becomes a crisis after being dismissed too many times. The warnings weren't random. They were the version of the problem that was still manageable. Has something in your own life ever grown heavier and more complicated the longer you avoided addressing it? The story of the person who always had another reason to wait. Think about someone whose entire pattern in life became defined by having a reason to wait every single time. Not this month, finances are tight. Not this year, timing isn't right. Not now, there's too much going on. Each individual reason sounded logical in isolation, but strung together across years, that pattern of waiting became the entire story. Someone who never actually arrived at the moment they kept insisting was coming, because they never stopped finding reasons to delay it. Have you noticed a pattern in your own life of always having a reasonable sounding excuse to wait just a little longer? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next chapter needs this kind of honesty. Why the cost of ignoring it isn't always obvious, right? Here's something worth understanding about how ignored warnings actually play out. The cost rarely arrives immediately and obviously. It arrives quietly, gradually, in ways that are easy to attribute to something else entirely. A relationship doesn't collapse the day you ignore the warning sign. It slowly erodes, month after month, until one day it's simply gone, and you tell yourself it just wasn't meant to last. The gradual nature of the cost is exactly what makes it so easy to keep ignoring the warning in the first place. Have you ever looked back at something that fell apart gradually and realized the warning signs had actually been there far earlier than you wanted to admit? Why regret usually arrives too late to change the outcome. Here's something painful worth naming honestly. The people who spent years walking past repeated warnings almost always experience regret eventually. But that regret usually arrives after the window for action has already closed, when the relationship is already gone, when the health has already declined significantly, when the opportunity has already passed to someone else entirely. Regret at that stage doesn't reverse the outcome. It simply confirms, painfully, that the earlier warnings had actually been worth listening to all along. Do you want to be the person who realizes the warning was real, but only after it's too late to act on it? Why? You're not destined to repeat their story. Here's something important worth holding on to tonight. Watching or hearing about someone else's story of ignored warnings doesn't mean you're destined to repeat it. You have information they didn't have or didn't use. The recognition right now that repetition is mercy, that small steps matter, that waiting for perfect readiness often becomes permanent avoidance. You are not required to walk the same path simply because you've seen where that path leads. What specifically makes you different from the people who kept walking past their own warnings now that you've seen clearly where that path leads? If this reflection is meaningful to you, that's exactly why this series was written. Subscribe now, because there's more waiting for whenever your next chapter needs this kind of clarity. Why someone else's story becomes your warning, not your shame. Here's something worth clarifying honestly. Recognizing yourself in someone else's cautionary story isn't meant to create shame. It's meant to create urgency, a genuine motivation to act differently than they did, while you still have the chance to. Shame paralyzes. Urgency moves you forward. The goal tonight isn't to feel bad about any similarities you've noticed. It's to use that recognition as fuel for finally doing something different. Can you take what you've recognized tonight and turn it into genuine motivation, rather than letting it settle into shame that keeps you frozen? Why your story can become someone else's warding too. Indie Direction here's something worth considering as this journey continues. Your own story, depending on what you choose from this point forward, will eventually become either a warning or an encouragement for someone else watching your life unfold. That's a real responsibility, whether you've fully recognized it or not. Every choice you make now is quietly writing the story that someone else might one day look to, either as proof that warnings matter, or as proof that they can safely be ignored. Which version of that story do you want your own life to eventually become for someone else watching? The final truth for today: the people who kept walking past their own warnings didn't end up where they did because they were fundamentally different from you. They simply kept choosing delay over action, one small decision at a time, until the accumulated weight of those decisions became their entire story. You have the exact same choice in front of you right now, and the outcome doesn't have to match theirs. If you finally chose action over continued delay tonight, how different might your story actually look a year from now, compared to the ones who kept walking past it? You've learned something today that carries real weight. That ignored warnings don't disappear. They simply grow heavier and harder to untangle. And that regret, when it finally arrives, usually comes too late to change the outcome. But you are not destined to repeat that story. You have exactly what you need right now to choose differently. Stay honest. Stay urgent without falling into shame. And let this recognition become fuel for genuine action. If this message reached something real in you today, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because more of these messages are coming exactly when you need them most. Their story doesn't have to become yours. Choose differently, starting now.